everyone, and welcome to the very first episode of Fund Facts with CDS Education Consulting. I'll be your host for this series. My name is Deltito-Sharrott. I'm an education fundraiser and strategist, and the series is really just going to be an opportunity to get a glance into my work, to share some free tips on grant making, on education strategy, and to be an opportunity to learn from some of my colleagues and clients in the field. Both in terms of exciting things that they have going on and also best practices that can help you to make your own fundraising practice better. As this is the first episode today, we're starting with the basics, and it'll just be myself and you. So we're talking about grant basics. What are grants and why should school and nonprofit leaders care about them? And so really, the objective of today's session is to discuss these pieces. Oftentimes we talk about grants. We know that there's some kind of an award that comes to a school or nonprofit for free and allows them to do something. But beyond that, I think there's a lot of mystery surrounding grants. What exactly does a grant application look like? How does it help me advance my mission? Why is it even something that I should consider spending my time on when I do have the charge of being client-facing, student-facing in my role as a nonprofit or school leader? And so what I want you to take away from this very first slide that defines what a grant is that grants are awards given by a government or another organization for a particular purpose. When we talk about an award, we're talking about not just a lump sum of cash that comes to an organization. In some cases, absolutely, awards do come in this way, grants come in this way, but also an award can come in a lot of different other formats as well. So for example, sometimes when an organization gets a grant, it comes in the form of a reimbursement. So the government may give you, say, $1,000 to implement your project. When you're done, you send them your receipts and you get the money back. In other cases, a check will come to you directly to advance your mission. And in other cases, an award might come as what we call in-kind. And this is really a donation of goods and services directly. So instead of giving you $1,000 to go buy gardening materials, an organization may just hand you the gardening materials directly without that exchange of funding. Given by a government or other organization is also an essential piece of this definition because it surrounds grants in really this relationship, which is such an important piece about grant funding. In every grant funding relationship, there is the funder and the organization getting funded. Depending on the type of grant, you might have the opportunity to actually, as a grantee, speak with that funder and plan together. In many cases, though, the funder has a very specific set of guidelines for what they're looking for, and they're only looking for specific organizations to give to that they feel they can enter into a relationship with to see the fruits of their labor, see the fruits of their investment in very specific areas. Now, in most cases, it takes time to build these relationships, and we'll get more into that into some of the slides that we have coming further. But I want you to keep in mind that when you're submitting a grant, you're not just kind of pushing out a paper into the ether. Usually there are committees or small groups of individuals that are making decisions about your mission, your vision, and how you'll use their dollars. And so this relationship piece becomes an important component of becoming a strong grant writer and fundraiser. And then this last piece is one of the defining characteristics of grants, that they're for a particular purpose. So while in rare circumstances, a funder may give money to your organization without many strings attached, Most times awards come as what we call restricted. And this means that the funder is giving them to you just to do exactly what you put forward in your grant application. And so the grant application really becomes a way to tell that funder, the person you're building a relationship with or organization that you're building a relationship with, how exactly you are going to use their dollars. This is different than if you're going to an individual donor or you're building other types of fundraising relationships where the story that you're telling them is largely just about your mission, your vision, your values, and they're investing either in you as a leader or your organization as a whole. Generally, for grants, they'll want to see that there's a specific program that they'll be funding, and they're going to want to know whether or not you have what's needed to make that program successful and what's needed to measure your success and report that back to them. And so what types of questions are typically included in a grant application? Now, grant applications vary quite a bit by the size, by the type of funder, etc. However, there are a few questions that are listed here that are essentially present in all grant applications in one format or another. The only way that these are reduced might be if you have an ongoing relationship with a funder, or it's very specific to organizations with just a certain mission already, and then they might ask you a subset of questions. But generally, you're going to see questions about your mission. You're going to be seeing questions about your vision. You're going to be seeing questions about who you serve. How do you define the group that you're working with? How much are you asking for? So again, a grant proposal is often really just a project plan. And within that plan, you're articulating exactly how you'll use the funds, how much are you asking for, whether that be high level, a dollar amount, or specifically line by line, I want X item to accomplish Y thing. The organization that's funding you is also really going to be interested in why these funds are necessary to advance your mission. This is another way where sometimes grant funding does differ from other types of funding that might come into your organization. If somebody's paying for a product and they're giving you money for it, it has to do with that exchange of product, right? They're not asking you, okay, because I paid you $10 for this item, how do I know that that $10 is going to go to either have an impact on an individual or create additional dollars for you? But when it comes to a grant, oftentimes funders really do want to know that every dollar that they give you is going to help you directly to advance your mission in some way. And then they're going to care about you as individuals, as leaders in this work as well, and the leadership teams you work with, whether that be the board of directors for your organization, your school principal, your nonprofit executive director, and kind of that top tier of leadership. What is the background that you have, not just in terms of your experience as a programmatic leader in whatever field you're working in, but really in terms of stewardship and management of grant funding, so that they know if they give you this money, you have the structures and the background to be able to use it effectively in the way that you said that you would. And then lastly, grantors are often looking to know, how will you know if your project is successful? And we'll talk about this a bit more in the next slide. But what I want you to pay attention to here is that impact really matters to funders. And so it's very important that we're not just saying, I need more books because that means that my students will have access to books. Yes, access is important, but what is the goal of that access? Is it to increase reading level? Is it to do a particular study on, on illustrations and be able to grow in their illustrating? There are a lot of different ways that you could go with a particular project. And your funder is going to want to know, what is the aim of your project? And then what tools and measures do you have in place to be able to evaluate that aim and your progress towards it? Like I said earlier, grant applications are not just a one blanket universal thing. There are many, many variations of grants, but they generally fall into these 4 or so buckets: your private grants, your corporate grants, your public or local state grants, and your public federal grants. When we say public, we're talking about grants that come from the government. When we say private, we're talking about grants that come from for-profit agencies, nonprofit foundations, or nonprofit foundations associated with for-profit agencies. And in the next few slides, I'm going to take you through some of the pros and cons of each of this type of grant. But I want you to pay attention to this chart because there are some key ways in which these applications vary from each other. When you're thinking about crafting the grant, they vary in terms of proposal length, how much you can expect to need to write to be able to put forward your application. They also vary in terms of the time of year that they can be submitted. In many cases, private grants have more opportunities per year for you to put in a grant application. They can generally be expected to be released every year around the same time for the same reason. Whereas with the public grants, there's some repetition, but largely they'll vary more year to year, and they may only be announced a month or two in advance of when they're made available. So there's a need to kind of be prepared in the background, but also leave the space available in that time leading up to these applications to do your creative thinking quickly to be able to successfully address these grants. There are 2 columns that you'll see here in terms of evidence and evaluation. Now, we're not going to go in deep into this today because this will be a future topic that we'll speak about together in much more depth. But what I'm speaking about here is the amount of information that a specific funder is going to want to know about past things that have been done that are similar to your program or are your program, and the evidence that they've shown some success on the metric that you're trying to move, and the way that you will evaluate the grant if you do get the funding from this particular granting agency, so that they know whether these dollars that they're giving to you are actually moving the needle. Depending on the type of the grant, you can go from having almost no requirements in these areas just to say, oh, I'm going to get some letters back, for example, from a couple of my participants, and that will be evidence that the project happened, and I'm going to submit receipts, right? Just thinking about those outputs, very light touch. Or it can go all the way to what you see in some of these federal grant applications and more in state applications, where they're asking you to cite specific research up front and to use similar models to evaluate your program when you're actually going through implementing the dollars that were given to you. And it's important to note here that this is such an important element of what public grants look like these days that oftentimes when you're applying for these grants, you might bring in an expert that has this program evaluation background to support you. So in a future episode, we'll bring in a program evaluator to talk about this in more detail. But I really want you to know that if you're looking at some of these public applications, you should be thinking critically about, do I have the capacity to not only implement the project, but to measure its successfulness? If the answer is no to those things, then I might consider taking on a third-party support or focusing more of your energy first on those private and corporate funders that don't have such stringent requirements for evaluation. And so to go a little bit deeper into each of the grant types, foundation grants are generally what people think about when they hear grant. And so some pros to foundation grants is that they generally have an easy format that includes the types of questions that I highlighted for you previously. They usually are low on the spectrum of what they're requiring for evidence and evaluation. And they allow for you to build relationships with a particular funder. In many cases, there's a single program officer at a foundation that's evaluating your grant, or a small committee, and you'll be able to understand them over time, build that relationship, invite that person in to become part of your community. On the other hand, foundation grants can often be limited in size. So there are some macro foundations that are giving hundreds of thousands, millions of dollars. But on average, many of the grants that I'm seeing in education that fit this profile are in the $10,000 to $50,000 range, with, I would say, most in that $10,000 to $25,000 range. And so it's important to think about how much effort it takes to put into a grant application of this scale for the amount of money that you might get back. In many cases, there's a clear return on investment for the time. But with particular funders, there may be circumstances where the things that they require of you in terms of the initial application being put together, in terms of the evaluation and reporting pieces, actually take away quite a bit when you're factoring in the time that you would either need to pay someone or spend of your time to complete the grant application. And so it's important to kind of keep that balance in mind. And in another session, we'll talk about that return on investment and how to evaluate what's worth your time there. And the last thing I want to say about foundation grants is, because they are so relational, sometimes it can take time to kind of break the mold, build the relationship with that particular funder. In many cases, you will see on a funder's website that grants are open by invitation only. And that means that that relationship needs to be in place prior to someone welcoming you to even submit an application. In some cases, even those organizations will accept something short up front, but it's kind of like submitting a job description when you don't have any relationship with the organization. It's much less likely that somebody will pick you as a high quality candidate out of a huge pool of high quality candidates than if you had previously had a conversation with their recruiting manager. They got to know you. They said, oh, I think you're a good fit for this program. And then you're applying. So there's clearly a mirror there, and some give and take in terms of those relationships having the potential to be really beneficial, but sometimes difficult to build up front. State and local grants are something that many organizations are grappling with right now, in particular because coming out of COVID, the government has made many, many more funds available to cities and state departments. What's nice about these state and local grants is that they're often limited to certain organizations within a certain catchment area. So if your organization fits that profile, you already have an advantage going into the competition. Another pro is that most of the time for these grant applications, they are more in-depth than a foundation grant, but significantly less in-depth than a federal public grant. The narrative is often quite short, and the focus really has to do more with what are you going to do with the funds when you get them, and how will you know whether you're successful. So, very straightforward. They really just are looking for what is your project plan so they can evaluate, if you're as or more prepared than someone else who's applying to use the funds given to the city or the state. Some of the cons that sometimes emerge with these public grants are that many of them have tedious portals to enter information into. Sometimes they are masked as bids in a bidding system. So you might have, like, one that comes up a lot in my region is the COMBI system in Massachusetts. Rhode Island has some emerging platforms that are similar. And each municipality often has their own kind of small portal that you have to work with. It sometimes can be hard to decipher whether you are eligible for one of these awards. And you often will be faced with higher reporting requirements and a higher burden of showing that your program has the likelihood to be successful and that you can evaluate it than a local corporate grant. Or a private foundation grant. And because of this, again, you have to consider how much time, energy, money is it going to take my organization to be able to manage those reporting components when I'm putting my project forward? And is this grant still a value add when I remove that time from the total benefit that the grant is giving me? And then I want to talk to you about federal grants. So federal grants can be something that kind of seems mystifying to people. The systems can be a bit confusing. The language follows a very standard format, and that at times can be arduous to get through, tedious to find exactly the information that you need in the subsection of this document in the law or the legalese of the regulations. And so, I think some of the hardest work that goes into applying for these federal grants is not actually writing the narrative, but it's taking the time to understand exactly what they're asking you for, both in terms of your narrative and your budget, but also what you need to do for evaluation, what you need to do for reporting, and all of the various forms that you need to complete, assurances that you need to complete, etc., that show that you'll use the dollars in a way that's in alignment with the grant program. They also take a significant amount of effort to complete. So where, a corporate or federal grant might take a few hours, maybe a bit longer if you're a less seasoned grant writer, generally these federal grants take the majority of time for several weeks to be able to complete in a way that's going to be rigorous and competitive. And so, I think organizations need to be fairly established before they're at a place where they're able to go after these funds. However, once they are in a position to do so, there's really some really clear benefits that come from these grant awards. In particular, there's national prestige, press, excitement that comes from your program. Oftentimes, once you get funded once, there's an opportunity for renewal of that award, expansion of that award, or other resources that can come to kind of match and pair onto the award that you're given. In addition, the funding can often come as very large amounts of money. So generally the federal awards start, $100,000 and above, and several can be multi-year, multi-million-dollar awards, even to very small organizations, which really can be game-changing for the way that a nonprofit or a small school operates. In many cases, single schools are not a strong fit for these federal grants, but it doesn't mean that they can't apply in partnership with other organizations as part of a consortium or through another model. And that's something that we can talk about again in another session that we do, thinking about scale, because when you talk about these proposals that are of the size of a federal grant, usually they want to know that there's a significant amount of individuals that are going to be impacted by the project, whether that be upfront or in the long term based on the outcomes that you pull out of doing this work. And then lastly, what I want to highlight about federal grants, because their size is larger and they're often multi-year grants, they can be a good fit for funding some of your staffing needs. So, if you're working at a university and you'd really love to bring on a graduate assistant to help you to evaluate a program, this is a great opportunity to do that. Or if you are a small nonprofit and you'd like to take on someone to be the program manager for the specific or program director for the specific project you put in this grant, it's very likely that you'll be able to fund that position through the grant. This differs from some of the smaller private awards because in those cases, generally, you're not getting to enough scale where staffing isn't going to be the only thing that you're asking for in that award. And generally, funders don't want to just fund staffing. They want to fund your program, and if staffing fits in a reasonable amount of that larger budget, then it often can be considered. But with these federal grants, usually the scale is wide enough to allow you to have investments of that size. And then lastly, I want just to mention that corporate grants and sponsorships are another kind of avenue for grant funding. Now, sometimes what a corporate entity will give you is a grant. When we think back about that grant definition, we're thinking in particular about that the funds are given for a particular purpose. So sometimes you need to make a request to a corporate entity for a specific purpose, and then they will support you by giving you a grant, and you'll have reporting and everything aligned to the same way you would with the other grant types. However, in many instances, corporates entities also give sponsorships, and these vary because they're usually what we call unrestricted dollars, which means that as long as they're advancing the mission of your organization, the corporation doesn't have too much say about the specific purpose of the funds. These are generally fairly simple to request, usually a one-page kind of letter that you can use for multiple corporate entities. Even some of the types of Donors Choose or other campaigns that you see online can be a good place to invite corporate sponsors to donate. And corporate sponsors also are sometimes interested in giving for a particular purpose, like for an event that you have coming up, or in exchange for some type of partnership. So maybe you'll highlight them in your annual report, and that'll give them some exposure. What's nice about these corporate sponsorships and campaigns around corporate grants is that they're relationship driven, and they're a good way to engage your board, members of your staff in building traction quickly to get some funding. So where an individual donor might only be able to give you, a couple $100, oftentimes even a small corporation might be willing to give somewhere in the $1,000 to $5,000 range for an award. And if you think about it, it doesn't take much to kind of plug and play with the letter that you might come up with for a corporate sponsor. And then, if you send that to 20 agencies and 4 of them come back at $5,000, there's $20,000 that you didn't have a very heavy lift in putting together. So in particular, when I have early stage nonprofits or small schools that I'm working with, I ask them whether they've considered a corporate engagement program, because this is often a way to start to fill the gap that you might have for a particular purpose while leaving the funds unrestricted, so they don't all have to go to the same thing. They can kind of fill in gaps in your organization in your greatest area of need. Some of the cons, however, is just like with those private foundations, sometimes it takes time to build relationships with corporations, especially the larger corporations. The national branch of a large bank, for example, is going to be a little bit harder to steward than the corner store near your organization, where you might just be able to go in and talk to the manager who you see every day when you're getting your morning coffee. And then sometimes corporate sponsors have very particular times of year where they want you to put in your request, and that can often take 6, 8, 12 weeks to hear a response back from them. So there is a bit of lag time there that can sometimes come with a little bit more ambiguity than some of the state, federal, and private grants. And then lastly, corporate sponsors often want to see tangible things happen as a result of their dollars. So while they may not restrict the exact purpose of their funds, often you'll need to tell a story about how the dollars that they're giving you are going to make an impact. And because of that, they're often best suited to what we call capital campaigns. And these are fundraising campaigns, a strategy around fundraising that's particularly suited towards either acquisition or update to a building, facility, or specific items that are going to help to support your program overall. What's nice is that they're often not as program driven. So many of the small foundation grants, they're going to want to know that the foundations are going to want to know you're taking their dollars and you're implementing a program with them. Say, for example, starting a cheerleading team for your school, right? And so they're going to want to know, why are you starting the cheerleading team? What are you hoping that students will get out of it? And what are you going to do with the funds that would work in support of that program at large? Now, corporate sponsor varies because they might want to know, how exactly are you spending these dollars and how will they exactly benefit the participants that you have. So a corporation may be much less interested in the fact that you're starting a program, and they might be more interested in seeing the tangible results of what you're doing. For example, for that same cheerleading program, maybe they want to see that you were able to buy uniforms, and for the dollars that they donated, you could buy X specific amount of uniforms, or you could buy a basketball hoop for the gym, or you could renovate this section of your building. And so corporate sponsors tend to see some of these tangibles as really important. And then finally, I really want to circle back to this initial piece that I spoke to you about in terms of the objectives of this presentation today. To talk about, now that we know about grants a little more at a baseline from having this conversation, why is it important that school and nonprofit leaders care about them? And I can give you a few answers to this question. You might have a few of your own, but what stands out to me above all else is that grants allow you to advance the mission of your organization. And in general, it's a fairly light lift in order to get a large return in terms of the funding that you will see. If you were to, for example, sell t-shirts to raise money for your school soccer team, think about the volume of t-shirts that you would have to sell to be able to get to a scale that could fund, $20,000 for the program. Whereas with the grant, it might just be one grant application or 4 corporate sponsors, or a relatively, light lift to come up with the same amount of funding. Another thing that I want to emphasize is that grants are often a way to offset the burden of cost of your programs for the constituents or the students that you serve. So if you'd like to start a new program at your school, instead of charging families to take place in it, or instead of, charging families a monthly fee for getting services from your nonprofit, grants can often help you to ensure that you're giving those things to the community for free. And then lastly, grants are really a good way to bolster your budget. So in a good fundraising plan, in a strong budget, no matter what, you will have multiple streams of income coming in. And again, we can talk about this more at a later time. But in order for that to be possible, it's super important that But in order for that to be possible, and in order for that to be beneficial, it's super important that you also understand that grants can play a role that is expanding beyond the core needs of your program. Yes, they can support the core needs of your program, but often you're looking at fee-for-service programs, you're looking at individual donors, you're looking at a number of different models that are building that baseline for your operating costs. And then above that, grants are a good way to ensure that you're doing all of the special things that are on top of that to advance your mission. And to do that more quickly, even before your nonprofit or your school is at total scale. And so, to recap what we talked about today, we looked at what is a grant, why is grant funding important, what's the general format of a grant, and how do grants vary. And if this is new to you, I encourage you to ask yourself these questions, pause, go back to earlier points in the video to check for your understanding. If there are additional questions that you have on these topics, feel free to drop a note in the chat box below. Thank you so much for your time today. If you would like to get in touch with me, my contact information is here. Thank you for following me on LinkedIn. And if you found this presentation to be meaningful, please hit that light bulb emoji or a like to tell me that you found that this presentation was enlightening for you. Thank you so much. Have a great day. Bye.